Well, thank you all for being so patient, and thank you all for coming. Today we are, of course, having our roundtable on LGBT issues in Russia, which for some reason we thought was relevant, for actually many obvious reasons. First thing I want to do is introduce my fellow panelists and point out, particularly for the Russian speakers here, that I feel a bit left out because I'm the only person here whose name does not represent an animal. So we're going to start with Brian Baer, who is professor of Russian and Translation Studies at Kent State University. He is the author of Other Russias, Homosexuality and the Crisis of Post-Soviet Identity, which received a 2011 Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title from the American Library Association. His most recent publication is the anthology Russian Writers on Translation, and he is currently completing a manuscript, Reading Between Translation and Identity in Modern Russian Literature. Then we have Anna Fishzone, who teaches at Williams College. She just recently completed and published her first book, which you should all run out and buy, called Fandom. You should also buy Brian's book too, but it's not as hot off the presses. Fandom, Authenticity, and Opera, Mad Acts and Letter Scenes in Fantasyekla Russia. Currently, she is working on a book on queer temporality and animation in the late Soviet period. And finally, Roman Utkin, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Yale, and is working on a dissertation that is tentatively entitled Russian Berlin, Emigre Culture in the Context of German Modernism and Soviet Avant-Garde, which discusses, among other things, homosexuality in the Russian diaspora. And I'm Elliot Borenstein, professor of Russian and Slavic Studies here at NYU, and the editor of the Jordan Center's blog, All the Russias, and I write a fair amount about popular culture and sexuality and so on and so forth. So the way we thought this roundtable would work is that each of us would speak for a few minutes, and then we would open up more for discussion. So I'm going to, since I'm standing here basically, I'm going to start with just a few introductory remarks, and then we will move on to our distinguished, wonderful panelists. But I did want to try to start this out with a kind of, with a sort of broader context that really asks the question, not only, why are we here for this event, but why is this happening in Russia now? Why is it that having an event like this is such an obvious idea? And why are the things that are going on in Russia that are bringing LGBT issues to the fore, why are they happening and what are they associated with? This is something that, of course, we're all interested in here. And when you read the media reports about it, when you hear people talking about it, they very often make reference to Russia's historical homophobia, which one can certainly make a case for, but that hardly puts Russia in a unique position in the world. That is, if we looked at the globe and tried to find a country that did not have a history of homophobia, we'd have a very blank globe. So that suggests that that simple historical element isn't really enough to explain why this is happening here and now. As many of you know, for most of the Soviet period, issues of sexuality, gender in particular, issues in the constellation that we now call queer, were really not discussed in public fora in the Soviet space. But with perestroika in the 80s and in particular in the 1990s, a decade that is now looked back on in the media as the worst decade ever, in the 1990s, my favorite decade I must say, there was an outpouring of media discussion and representations of lesbians, gays, transsexuals, and to some extent of bisexuals. And what was fascinating as this happened is, on the one hand, there was a more liberal, open approach to people who fit the category that Russians call sexual minorities than one might previously have expected. But a lot of that sympathy, at least as I saw it, a lot of that sympathy was based on the idea of coming up with a way that understood queer people in a way that reinforced standard gendered notions. So for instance, in the early 90s, the most positive portrayals of queer people that I remember seeing were of trans people. Because it was possible to represent trans people as having a disorder in which the body was different from the self, and what we're trying to do is restore the natural order of male and female. Now, obviously, this can be seen as a regressive way of looking at transgender, but it was a way that fit very, very well for the sexual culture in Russia of the 90s and earlier. But the other thing that I think makes homosexuality such a troubling issue for Russia in the 90s and later is that the 90s saw a real resurgence in an ethos of masculinity. The idea that the Soviet Union was a kind of nanny state that took away all initiative from men, left them with really no way to express themselves, and that now in the new capitalist order, when everybody's opening shady businesses right and left, this is a place for men to be men and women to be trophy wives. And of course, if we factor in the historical disdain for feminism in the last several decades of the Soviet Union, and the fact that women had to serve a double shift of work much more intensely than they did in the West, the idea that the man would be the breadwinner and strong and taking care of everything and the woman would be at home was appealing to a lot of women. And gay men, and really much of the I would say hysteria about LGBT issues in Russia is about gay men. Gay men did not fit this paradigm in any way. They as a phenomenon, really threatened to subvert the very ideology that was really being pushed forward. Another thing that I think complicates all of this is how easy it is to meet educated people in Russia who will say that they don't know anyone who is gay. Now, this is not something, this again would be similar to a situation you might find in Europe in the West several decades ago, or perhaps similar to the situation that you'd find now with transgender, that many people don't know that they know anyone who is transgender. And a large majority of people who are asked don't know that they know anyone who is gay, which then allows for a representation of them as these kind of abject freaks who are not like us. And as we know, if Dick Cheney can be for gay marriage because he has a gay daughter, then clearly knowing someone who is LGBT makes a big difference. And this too is related, I think, to another issue in which the whole question of LGBT rights and activism doesn't map very well onto our Western notions of activism and of freedom, and particularly the idea of being out. That in the West, of course, we are used to the idea of pride and out. That these are the two big things around which gay, lesbian, queer communities have been able to organize themselves. And in Russia, I'm not just thinking of the outlawing of gay pride parades and so on and so forth, but I think in Russia, that, which is not the product of a Protestant tradition, there is not this expectation of identity between your inner self and your outer self. In fact, quite the opposite. It's not just a matter of privacy, it is a matter of not even expecting there to be a visibly coherent self from the way you are at home and the way you are in public. There is a tradition of segmenting yourself, and the idea of displaying, of being out in really any way, is, I think, not necessarily not as congruent with the way people are used to thinking as it would be in a society formed by Protestantism, or certainly in America, which is a very confessional society. And then also, I think this is also connected to questions of the media. Now, obviously, it's always a problem to argue that the media simply shape opinion and people just react. That represents a very old-fashioned media theory that goes back several decades. But it is important to know that the mediascape, not including the internet, the TV mediascape right now in Russia, for most people, particularly who don't live in the capitals, is not nearly as segmented as what you would be used to, say, in the United States. That is, it's still very possible for the major channels to shape the discussion much more obviously, much more strongly than happens here. And so if these questions are being raised in a particular negative slant and being associated with pedophilia and so on and so forth, there is no alternative widespread public media space for reconceiving the ideas. And of course, the persecution of LGBT people fits very, very well with a politics that is based on rallying the Russian public against some kind of enemy, an external enemy and an internal enemy. This fits very well with the comparisons Masha Gessen and others have made between the persecution of LGBT people and the persecution of Jews, because LGBT people in Russia are set up to represent a kind of fifth column, to be a kind of Western import or some sort of Western disease. And finally, the last point I want to make that I think is really important but very hard to articulate about how you can end up with a situation in which the public feel threatened by an almost invisible LGBT minority, since no one knows that they know gay people, is that one thing that seems to characterize a lot of public discussion and a lot of anxiety in popular culture in the past 20 years is what I call the complex of the beset majority. This feeling that any time a minority group, a minority nationality, any kind of minority identity gets represented, has its rights asserted, this is to the detriment of the majority. That the majority is being represented as under attack, that is being besieged. And so you end up in this bizarre situation where no one thinks they know any LGBT people, and the LGBT people are threatening to destroy Russia as we know it. So what you can see there is, I think, a situation that is so much a construct of the media and the public discourse, and has and does not have nearly as much to do with what people are doing in their everyday lives. Those are just really some opening thoughts I wanted to put out there. And now I'd like to go to, we decided that, Kamana's going to be next, or who's going to be next? Brian? Brian, okay. To Brian, do you want to sit or stand?
I'll sit.
Okay, so now Brian will speak.
Well, I noticed that a lot of the media coverage, or Western media coverage of the current anti-gay propaganda law in Russia is centered on the law in the context of Putin-era politics and society. And this is absolutely legitimate, of course, but I think I want to follow Elliot's remarks and try to put this in a larger cultural and historical context that will reveal a kind of cultural logic to this law. I think it's helpful to start out by thinking of the fact that, or by considering the fact that Russians never had anything comparable to a Kinsey report or the Masters and Johnson studies that, starting in the 50s, gave the average American a way to talk about sex and sexuality that was neither moralizing on the one hand, nor pornographic and obscene on the other. And it finally allowed the mass media to deal with issues of sex and sexuality in ways that were not completely moral and religious. In fact, I happened to come upon an old episode of I Love Lucy, and she makes a joke about the Kinsey report. So I mean, it was really out there in the public space. Russians, as Elliot mentioned, the Soviet regime dealt with issues of sex and sexuality with absolute silence. True homosexuality was criminalized, but in the 1930s, crime blotters were removed from Soviet newspapers because crime was considered to be an embarrassment. It should have disappeared with the coming of communism. So there was really, they didn't make a big deal out of the homosexuality. It wasn't talked about. Scholars were discouraged from studying this. They went so far as in translations of ancient Greek and Roman poetry, any homosexual references were either deleted or changed to heterosexual references. So homosexuality was really just invisible in the culture. And so when, with the lifting of censorship restrictions in the late 80s and the early 90s, homosexuality suddenly burst onto the media scene in Russia, many Russians had the feeling that homosexuality itself had appeared in Russia, that there had been no homosexuality in the Soviet Union, and that now Russia was being overrun by homosexuals. And this created in the mind of many Russians an association between homosexuality and what we now could consider the failed transition to Western political and economic models. And so as that transition turned sour, so too did representations of homosexuality, which was often considered Western and Western borrowing and a dangerous Western influence. But what's also interesting is that the discourse that appeared came from everywhere. There were suddenly translations of all different types of Western literature, of pre-Soviet Silver Age literature where there was talk of homosexuality. They resurrected the works of Vasily Rozanov, who was considered in his time the Russian Freud, but he had his own very much dated views of homosexuality. And these all appeared on the scene together in one time. It was a very, I would say, cacophonous discourse. And unfortunately, there were no authoritative bodies to control the discourse, to make sense of it for Russians. The psychiatric establishment had been completely compromised, marginalized and compromised in the Soviet era. Psychiatric hospitals were routinely used to punish dissidents, and so they didn't have a voice in post-Soviet Russia to really lend any of the quasi-scientific heft that the American Psychiatric Association is able to do. I mean, to mention, if Chris Christie could sign a law that banned this therapy to switch someone's sexual orientation because the APA said it was harmful. I mean, this says that there is this scientific discourse that transcends political parties to some degree. None of that was present in Russia. And so the discourse that happened was extremely varied, contradictory, and as I said, there were no scholars who studied this except perhaps Igor Kohn, and with his death in 2011, I don't think there's anyone of his stature who is speaking out on these issues. They wouldn't do it, it would ruin their careers. So I'd like to give a few examples of this cacophonous discourse in post-Soviet Russia on the issue of homosexuality. The first example is a 1998 Russian translation of a book by the American psychologist Alexander Lowen that appeared in English in 1965. It's called Love and Orgasm. It has a horrible chapter on homosexuality. I'll give you a taste of it. This is a quote from the book. Lowen writes, "Despite the protestations of some confirmed homosexuals that homosexuality is a, in quotes, normal way of life, the average invert is aware that his propensity amounts to an emotional illness." This is then followed by a number of case studies of his patients where he basically describes gay people as walking corpses. He says they smell, I mean, it's horrific. This was published in Russia in an unabridged version, and what I think is telling is that there's no introduction. Nothing that situates this for Russians, that historicizes, that contextualizes his ideas. And in fact, the opening line of the book, which Lowen writes, it's only been about 15 years since we finally broke the shackles of the Victorianism that we've lived in for so long. I mean, I think Russians might have interpreted that as meaning the 1980s, whereas Lowen was talking about the post-World War II era. So again, no voices to make sense of this stuff for Russians. The other example I would mention is a book by Dilia Enikeyeva, who supposedly holds a higher degree in psychology. And she's written a number of books, kind of a new genre in Russia, pop psychiatry. And her first book was called Sexual Pathologies, in which homosexuality is listed side by side with necrophilia and pedophilia and things like that. This kind of homosexuality as perversity is still very dominant in psychiatry, especially this pop psychiatry. Her next book was called Gays and Lesbians, an entire book, this is it, dedicated to the topic, and it really, I think, illustrates this kind of the cacophonous nature of the discourse, because on the one hand, she has the perfunctory, I have gay friends and I have no problem with homosexuality, but then she goes on to say how homosexuals are seducing young Russian kids, and that once someone is seduced into homosexuality, he can never be reintegrated into a heterosexual lifestyle, so that this is a great danger. One of her chapters is entitled, "How is it that homosexuals are increasing but they can't reproduce?" So it's, it's this paranoid discourse. And what's also very odd is that, whereas sometimes it's very much like, Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda, about elites who control Russia from behind the scenes, it's punctuated by very crude and vulgar anecdotes about sodomy and gay people. So again, the discourse is just contradictory, and there is no one around, I think, to manage it. And the last book I'll show is this in a series called The Taste of Scandal, and it's called Russia's Gay Elite. And the author charges, like in Ikeva, that there are a bunch of gay people running the political, economic, and show business elites in Russia. And again, they're seducing the children, etc. So it's this hidden threat, very paranoid when you read the things. It's printed by a decent press in a circulation of 50,000, so a decent size circulation. All right, and the other thing I wanted to mention is something Elliot touched upon, this idea about privacy. What we saw in post-Soviet Russia was a real kind of return, if there was ever, privacy the way we understand it in the States in terms of legal protections in Russia. There was a return to privacy in the post-Soviet period, basically as a reaction to the treatment of the Soviet regime to Russians' personal lives, right? The invasions of every kind. And so many writers and artists retreated to what has been called a hyper-individualism and a rejection of engaged art as an anti-Soviet gesture. And the problem is that this made the whole idea of coming out and also of gay literature and art kind of unthinkable in that context. And as Kirill Medvedev, who's a critique of this hyper-individualism, he describes it like this in an article called Beyond the Poetics of Privatization. He writes, amid the general depolitization of the Yeltsin era, these post-underground writers like Stanislav Lvovsky and Dmitry Kuzmin is also an openly gay writer, firmly define themselves as a gathering of private persons, contented to each other above all by their shared interest in formal poetic experimentation and by their conception of the private character of their own poetic projects. So that meant that art was no longer a place where that being out was seen as a viable and necessary political gesture. So it didn't make sense to Russians. And repeatedly in interviews they would insist, I don't want to be seen as a gay artist. I am not a gay artist. So I think those two kind of big picture things help situate maybe a little bit this law. It's specifically, I think, important to remember, against propaganda, right? It's against this positive discourse. It's a post-Soviet distinction with the Soviet criminalization of homosexuality as an identity and as an act.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Elliot. And I think in my talk, which is going to be on Kvir по-русски, queer in Russian, and language and sexual identity in Russia, I will certainly echo much of what has been already said. And I just wanted to welcome all the people who made it here from New Haven and say that much of my talk, in a way, emerged through the conversations with my colleague at Yale, Bella Gregoria, for whom I'm really very grateful. And so I would like to begin my presentation by reading a passage from a great and ever-relevant novel by Benedikt Yerofeev from 1970 called Moskva Petushki, Moscow to the End of the Line. And I quote, I should tell you that homosexuality in our country has been overcome once and for all, but not entirely. Or entirely, but not completely. Or else, entirely and completely, but not once and for all. What do people think about now? Nothing but homosexuality. So today, 40 years ago, over 40 years later, rather, I'm sorry, the Russian public still seems to be preoccupied with homosexuality in Russia. And the discourse about the issue is just as ambiguous and contradictory as in this passage from Yerofeev's novel. And for the country that probably had no sex at all for much of the Soviet century, LGBT issues in Russia now resonate exceptionally widely in seemingly all public strata. As in any other society of compulsory heterosexuality, queer individuals in Russia remained unnamed for around a long time, and that is to say that the existence of queers was sort of, quote-unquote, an open secret. And so the language used to describe gays and lesbians in Russian was either highly specialized, reserved for medical and judicial purposes, or utterly obscene and therefore taboo. And the linguistic lacuna of vocabulary intelligible by all and of neutral vocabulary to address LGBT individuals also saliently underscored their invisibility in the country. So while observing the progress of the recent homophobic legislation in Russia, I was fascinated by the way the politicians tiptoed around the words, the very terms they used to say gay, essentially, and ultimately resorting to such generally descriptive euphemisms as personals of non-traditional orientation. And if you remember the infamous Statute 6.21 of the Russian Code of Administrative Offenses, the anti-gay law, was circulated as propaganda against law against the propaganda of homosexuality among minors. When it was a project, but it was adapted as law against propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations among minors. So it's really a lot of discomfort around the word. And so today I'd like to just say a few words about the speakability of what used to be the Russian unspeakable. That is about the kinds of words that are widely used in Russia today to address queer citizens and forge public discourse about them. I'm particularly interested in the linguistic and cultural etymologies and applications of words that are supposed to mean gay in the culture with linguistically engraved homophobia, as you will see, unless you already know. You'll notice that there is a glaring dearth of words for queer women, the only universally known term being lesbian, lesbianka. And it seems to me that since only male homosexuality was criminalized in the Soviet and imperial periods, it somehow also reflected in the language that only, the language where the terminology was exclusively for queer men. And so, going back to the contemporary period, today's Russia, at the height of the nationwide debates about homosexuality in May of this year, an extremely popular blogger, a very successful businessman and entrepreneur and a culture pundit named Artemy Lebedev posted on his LiveJournal account, and LiveJournal is still a big thing in Russia, posted the following entry titled LGBT I'm lost in questions. And I actually will read it first in Russian, and I know there's a fair amount of Russian speakers in the audience because much of it is not easily translatable. So quickly, in Russian. ЛГБТ, теряюсь в вопросах. Как вы относитесь к лесбиянкам, геям, бисексуалам и трансгендерам? Нужно ли разрешить однополые браки? Чем брак двух мужиков отличается от брака человека и козы? Может ли трансгендер выйти замуж, жениться, зарегистрировать брак с бисексуалом? Почему в Фейсбуке банят за сиськи, но можно вести сообщество про гомосеков? Почему в Европе пидоров сколько хочешь, а у нас гей-парады запрещают? Может, мы что-то важное выпускаем? And I'm also omitting a sentence that is just really very utterly obscene and too offensive, and also, for that reason, untranslatable. But to give you...
now I want to know what it is.
I'll show you afterwards. In English, what I just said was, and what do you think about lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people? Should same-sex marriage be allowed? How is a marriage between two guys is different from a marriage between a man and a goat? Can a transgendered person marry a bisexual person? Do they marry, or do they register their marriage? And this is really quite untranslatable, and I'll address the verb to marry in Russian just in a minute. He continues, why on Facebook one's banned for posting tits, but it's allowed to have a group about fairies? Why are there so many fags in Europe, while here the gay pride parades are forbidden? Can it be that we are missing something important? And well, as much as Lebedev pretends to be blissfully ignorant, he skillfully conjures up almost all of the existing vocabulary concerning Russian queers in one passage, from the borrowed LGBT to lesbianki, gay, bisexual, and transgender, and you can probably figure out the origins of the words. And to, of course, to the homegrown gomoseki and pidore, just like my absolute favorites. Moreover, Lebedev highlights the heteronormativity of the Russian language, and that it's not ready to adapt to the progress of LGBT rights, especially on the marriage front. And this is where his wordplay with the verb to marry comes in, because how would one say in Russian that two men are getting married when the very verb to marry presupposes fixed gender categories? It's either a man marries a woman, женится, or vice versa, a woman marries a man, выходит замуж, and there is nothing in between. It's in the language. So, and of course, the source of Lebedev's bewilderment comes from the West. If you recall, he's saying, why are there so many fairies in Europe? And here, we don't even have gay pride parades. So, as both Brian and Elliot were saying, Russia traditionally tends to blame the West for actually a great deal of morally corrupting exports, but homosexuality is really high among them. The popular and delightfully old-fashioned Russian encyclopedia published in the late 19th century of Brockhaus and Fron, more precisely 1897, had this to say about sodomy. And I quote, "It is a very ancient vice. There are indications of its existence among Jews, Persians, Celts, Greeks, and the Indians of America." End of quote. So these ethnographic findings were then reinforced in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, published in the year 1930, the year the word homosexualism, homosexuality, officially enters Russian language. And since then, the very word, homosexualism, generated a plethora of offensive words, from gamasek, used by Lebedev, to gamikadze, by analogy with kamikadze, and there's so much in between. And before homosexualism became the standard term, there were the words for sodomy, muzheloshstvo, literally meaning lying with man, derived from the Church Slavic translation of the Bible. And there was pederasty, pederastia, which was first noted in dictionaries, in Russian dictionaries, in the mid-19th century. And since then, both words muzheloshstvo and pederastia are used interchangeably. And so the phenomenon has a quite long linguistically recorded history. The trouble is with finding and using words that are at least somewhat neutral and don't carry a heavy load of additional connotations. Just like in many other languages, the euphemistic nature of the words that designate a person's sexual orientation engenders a great deal of ambiguity and double entendre. In English, even, right, the meanings of the words like gay and queer are, though predominantly in the sphere of sexuality, but not entirely in the sphere of sexuality. And in Russian, the boundaries for similar kinds of words are even blurrier. And there is, of course, the word голубой, and if I may, so the gay, голубая вид России, it's literally, it means light blue color, and hence the color of the volume. If you didn't get it, and of course, it's not accidental that a rooster is pictured on the cover. Pituch, colloquially, a derogatory offensive term for that originates in prisons, means something like a faggot. But yes, with голубой it means literally light blue color, and in colloquial usage it means a gay man. As a counter term to голубой, there is розовая, or pink, for lesbians. Both terms are strictly colloquial. And since there are no alternatives to naming those colors, wonderful light blue and pink hues, the dominant meanings of the words are still within the color vocabulary, the color palette, and they're very strong. And so the queer meanings of голубой and розовая are actually waning, and now are somewhat old-fashioned. So whenever I teach Russian in Russian classrooms, I'm uncomfortable with the word голубой because it's color. You have to know it, and it also means gay, but really people don't really use it anymore as much. It's kind of old-fashioned. It's dated, and of course a potential non-offensive umbrella term in Russian would be queer, Russian queer, and it now still colloquially tends to be applied only to men. And there was a magazine, a journal that was started publication, I think, in the early 2000s, which features very beautiful men, usually quite ripped physically, on the cover. And but queer also is used widely, very widely among academics and LGBT activists. And the problem being that in Russian, first of all, it sounds extremely foreign, but then also it, while the LGBT activists are trying to export the 40 plus years of political activism in Russian, that cultural heritage is not there. It's a rather empty word at this point. And, but on the opposite side of neutrality, there is the word pidaras. It's a highly offensive term, similar to faggot in English. And, but in contemporary Russian, it's used with remarkable frequency. And Lebedev's Life Journal, in its entirety, would be a good illustration to that. So like the word голубой, pidaras has two general meanings. Unlike in the case with голубой, the original meaning of pidaras was influenced by sexuality because it derives from the word pederastia. However, now it evolved into a term that spans the more and less offensive meanings under the general rubric of jerk or bastard. And like in English, when we say bastard, we don't necessarily mean that the person doesn't have a legitimate father, was born out of wedlock, but in Russian with pidaras, there is this kind of very blurry ambiguity. On the one hand, it has very strong connotations of gay, very offensive, but also it's just, oh, you're being such a bastard to me. It's a strictly male term, as you may surmise, and it's also but one from the plethora of a very derogatory derivatives from pederasty. It's also, the trouble is that it's also, because of its root, pede, it's often conflated with pedophilia as well, and so even the word pidaras becomes even more offensive because sometimes people, and hence propaganda of homosexuality and pedophilia as being lobbied, because the two terms, like DD and cable, for instance, wouldn't really see necessarily a great difference between the two. And so the advance of civil rights movement and political correctness in Russia, however meek, also gave rise to such hybrid variations of pidaras as the neologism liberas. It couples two words, liberal and pidaras, or pederast. And, but then also there is tolerast, which is a product of tolerance and pederasty. And again, so these are very, very foreign, borrowed Western concepts of liberalism and tolerance. And on the very low level of language, there is this wide resistance against these terms and to borrowed words, and so to meanings that come with them. And the painfully frequent circulation of words like pidaras betrays at the same time an acute awareness of homosexuality, I would say even hyper-awareness of homosexuality in the society to which it's supposedly so foreign. And at the same time, it also highlights the willful, perhaps, ignorance of what it actually is in that, in the coupling of homosexuality with pedophilia. And in his blog, Lebedev, in his sincere cynicism, is lost in questions. Я теряюсь в вопросах about LGBT. And so he mixes the words gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender with the locally flavored gomosek and pedo, as if to indicate that those foreign borrowings actually have very simple and comprehensible equivalents at home. So that is to say, he seems to have a problem with the fact that these imported words are not only neutral in meaning, but rather positive and reaffirming. So some deeds of the Western tolerists and liberists, and again, this wide, forceful resistance to the potential positive meaning of the words. And at the same time, Lebedev doesn't mention the advance in Russian of such words like natural, naturalka, and naturale, which means straight folk. That is to say, while Russian language is adjusting to the uncomfortable presence of the LGBT community and finding new word to talk about queers in Russia, the language generated a term for heterosexual people, the need for which affirms the visibility of queer presence and maybe even a step toward understanding the diversity of sexual identities.
Okay, this is going to be a little different than what we've heard so far, but it ties back to what you said, a few of your points already. So, I am in love, as I haven't been in love for a long time, wrote Fyodor Ilyich Tchaikovsky on January 19, 1877, in Father Mordin. Can you guess with whom? He is of middle height, fair, with wonderful brown eyes. When he caresses me with his hand, when he lies with his head on my chest and I play with his hair and secretly kiss it, when for hours on end I hold his hand in my own and tire in the battle against the urge to fall at his exquisite feet and kiss them, passion rages in me with unimaginable force. My voice shakes like that of a youth, and I speak some kind of nonsense. However, I am far from desiring physical consummation. I feel that if that occurred, I would cool toward him. I would feel disgusted that this wonderful youth stooped to sex with an aged and fat-bellied man. How horrible this would be, and how disgusting I would become to myself. Tchaikovsky here referred to the 22-year-old violinist Joseph Kotek, for whom he wrote his well-known and at the time unplayable violin concerto, and with whom he had a long and turbulent relationship until Kotek died of tuberculosis at the age of 29. There were many such letters from the composer to his favorite and also gay brother Modya. Some letters were odes to delicate and beautiful conservatory students. A few contained arch commentary about male prostitutes in Vienna or the St. Petersburg Totki. These are men who were known to be part of the homosexual subculture in the parlance of the 19th century. Tchaikovsky recounted frequently over many years and with great candor his passionate love affairs, meaningless sexual escapades, and everything in between, all with men. This used to have a slide presentation. I'll take it, Tchaikovsky. Imagine it. Okay. On September 23rd, 2013, the Metropolitan Opera opened its season with a performance of a new production of Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin. Peter Gelb, the general manager of the Met, tends to treat opening night as a statement of artistic purpose that sets the tone for the rest of the season. In this case, a celebration of Russian culture and music with maestro Valery Gergiev at the helm and soprano Anna Netrebko as Tchaikovsky's proud and fiery Tatiana. If you've ever been to the Met, you know that the two most visible groups in the audience are gay men and Russians. So problems arose for Gelb. In the weeks leading up to the opening gala, newspapers and blogs were abuzz with calls for the Met to dedicate the evening to gay and lesbian Russians as a protest against the law on banning propaganda on non-traditional sexual relationships. Musicians and sundry celebrity opera fans tried to compel Netrebko and Gergiev, who advocated for Putin actually during last year's elections and have received generous financial backing for artistic ventures in return, to voice support for LGBT people in Russia. An online petition organized by composer Andrew Rudin and signed by over 9,000 people also clamored for a strong statement from the Met. Gelb declined. Netrebko posted something on Facebook like, "I don't discriminate against anybody," whatever, like that. That's not what it's about. And then Gergiev was totally silent. In a New York Times piece on September 19th, Zachary Wolf, commenting on the Onegin backstage drama and explaining the aims of the online petition, noted in passing that while those calling for the dedication and many music scholars believe Tchaikovsky was gay, it is not universally accepted at the moment. Come again, Tchaikovsky's homosexuality is not really a theory to accept or deny. It was a light drama copiously documented by the composer himself. So who exactly does not accept the fact that Tchaikovsky loved men? Only Philistines think this. The screenwriter Yuri Arabov told Izvestia recently. What Philistines believe should not be shown in films. Arabov is currently working on the biopic Tchaikovsky with the director Kirill Serebrennikov. Scheduled for release in 2015, it is supposed to show, quote, Russia's most revered composer as a man who is marked by rumors and suffers greatly for this. End quote. Recently, Serebrennikov posted a synopsis of the film describing it as the true story of the tragic love and death of the brilliant Russian composer, in which he runs into his first love at a ball only to find that she is married. When she finally leaves her husband, the composer dies of cholera with her at his side. Okay, so despite this fantastically heterosexual take on Tchaikovsky's biography, Fond Kino, that's the federal cinema fund in Russia, refused to support the project. Now back to the Met. Audience members of the opening gala found an insert in their programs, a copy of an article by Gelb that had appeared in Bloomberg News the weekend before. While he was confident that, quote, many members of our company join me in personally deploring the tyranny of Russia's new anti-gay laws, it would not be appropriate to dedicate the Met's performances to political causes. We respect the rights of activists to picket our opening night, and we realize that we provided them with a platform to further raise awareness about serious human rights violations abroad, end quote. Gelb ended with the following. Although Russia may officially be in denial about Tchaikovsky's sexuality, we're not. The Met is proud to present Russia's great gay composer. That is a message in itself. So more happened that night. Several dozen demonstrated near the Lincoln Center Plaza, calling on Gergiev and Netrebko to speak out against the anti-gay law, and in the best operatic tradition, a few hecklers in the top of the Rosen family circle shouted at the start of the performance, "Putin, end your war on Russian gays." They were asked to leave, and the opera proceeded without further disturbance. The following morning, Anthony Tomasini, arguably New York's most influential music critic, grumbled about the disruptive protesters. Putin, the organizer of the online petition, declared victory, calling the program insert a de facto dedication, and praising Gelb's decision to wear rainbow suspenders to the opening. And he was interviewed with the, and he showed them. So why does this all matter? It matters in part because Valery Gergiev is the Russian Lenny Bernstein. Earlier in his career, there were rumors of Gergiev's bisexuality, but that's not the parallel I'm making here. Passionately unkempt and permanently hungover, constantly torturing orchestras and singers with his finger-twitching, visceral conducting style, Gergiev is probably the most active musician on the classical circuit and the most ubiquitous promoter of Russian musical culture. He is also one of the highest paid classical musicians in the world and the industry's biggest celebrity. Quote, he is in fact so active, so rich, and so powerful that he doesn't use email, ever. That's in the words of one blogger. So in early May, shortly after being named the first recipient of the newly resurrected Stalin-era Hero of Labor Award, Gergiev unveiled the entirely state-funded $750 million theater known as Mariinsky II in Petersburg. The Mariinsky II is probably the most expensive performing arts center built since Lincoln Center, if we account for inflation. I tried to watch the video of the grand opening gala of Mariinsky II. It was excruciatingly Vegas-like, gaudy and nationalistic, with a rendition of Schubert's Ave Maria by a choir of 200 school children and an appearance by Boris Godunov in a replica of the Tsar's box. This is the centerpiece of a four-tiered stage set reproduction of the interior of the original Mariinsky. This was on stage. Of course, Putin had opened a ceremony in state for the performance, the camera periodically cutting to him sitting in his demure orchestra seats, and then to the sweat-drenched Gergiev, the Mariinsky's artistic and general director, who swayed and waved his arms about in the pit in his typical manner. The close relationship between classical music, and especially opera, and the state, as well as the importance of high culture in articulating the national idea, has a long history in Russia. Most of us are familiar with Stalin's love for opera, Russian historical operas like Ivan Susanin in particular. During Tsar's times, Anton Rubinstein, twice director of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, the Gergiev of the 1860s and 70s, repeatedly sought financial backing from the ministries of internal affairs, finance, and the imperial court. Although Russia's conservatories, seedbeds of national culture, were founded by a voluntary association, the Russian Musical Society, rather than the court, their story of professionalization entailed viz for Tsar's administrative intervention and funding, not a growing independence from the state, as in Western Europe. But why didn't Gergiev speak out against Russian anti-gay law? He was performing in New York after all, and he is an international celebrity. Would a muted statement really have damaged irrevocably his relationship with Putin and curtailed further funding for his projects? And what about Netrebko? I mean, she draws a paycheck from the Met, and much recognition is showered upon her here and in Europe. So she barely even appears in Russia. And one should know that in contrast, Tchaikovsky, though not especially political, had spoken out in support of Rubinstein, a Jewish convert to Russian Orthodoxy, when the latter was viciously attacked in the Petersburg press about the high Jewish enrollment in the conservatories and music schools. And Rubinstein, despite dependence on an anti-Semitic state, consistently used his musical compositions and polemical writings to advocate a liberal politics, a broadened understanding of Russian nationality that included Jews, and conservatory training as a means to social advancement and religious emancipation. So the comparison between the current plight of the Russian LGBT and that of Jews, not late imperial Jews, but Soviet Jews, has been made numerous times, as Elliot pointed out in recent months. Journalist and activist Masha Gessen has drawn the parallel more than once in her blog and in television interviews. She took the message here in New York to Sharon Kleinbaum, rabbi of the world's largest LGBT synagogue, who then related to over 1,000 people in a Rosh Hashanah sermon. Kleinbaum, ventriloquizing Gessen, told American queer Jews that Russia's gays and lesbians are facing the same discrimination and persecution that Soviet Jewry did in the Brezhnev years. And it was because of international pressure that Soviet Jews were allowed to immigrate. Now it was time to demand asylum for Russia's LGBT people. Comparisons have also been made between Putin and Hitler. In an open letter addressed to David Cameron and the International Olympic Committee, the British actor Stephen Fry, as some of you might know, likened Russia to Nazi Germany and claimed that referring to Tchaikovsky as gay was regarded as a crime in Russia. I'm sure that's true. And composer and conductor Nicholas de Mason wondered whether Gergiev had adopted a stance similar to that of the great conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler, who stayed in Germany throughout the Second World War. Although Furtwängler was accused throughout his life of being a Nazi sympathizer, many now believe that he remained precisely because he saw the Nazi regime as a threat, not only to Jewish culture, but to all culture, especially German culture. At his denazification trial, Furtwängler said, "I knew Germany was in a terrible crisis. I felt responsible for German music, and it was my task to survive this crisis as much as I could. The concern that my art was misused for propaganda had to yield to the greater concern that German music must be preserved, that music be given to the German people by its own musicians." De Mason juxtaposed Furtwängler's statements to comments made by Gergiev in an interview after the opening of Mariinsky II. Russia is seen very often as a country that thinks, as Gergiev now, that thinks, but not always deeply enough, and acts maybe not always in the right way. The whole world makes mistakes, Russia included, and the whole world makes good things, thank God, Russia included. So my question, perhaps intentionally naive, is this: are Russian queers the new Jews? Or put another way, are LGBT people Russia's latest queer subjects? Are the historical and contemporary attempts to excise Russian Jews and queers, at least in the arts, mere coincidence, or can we make meaning and meaningful politics here? Haven't there always been cultural and emotional affinities between gay men, Stanislav Richter, Tchaikovsky, and Jews, Vladimir Horowitz, Rubinstein? Moments of overlap when these figures were entrusted with carrying Russian romantic identity precisely as shame and difference, Russia as excess, all feelings in mouth, unable to stop making statements, signifying loudly and in extremes. Hasn't the Jew functioned as Russia's queer body, an indicator that a mistake has been made and contradictions have been repressed? And I think of the popular 1970s Soviet animated character Goluboy Shchenok, Blue Puppy, who was Goluboy and strange, bullied and then shunned by his own community when a foreign pirate invaded his island. So, while there are similarities between the positions occupied by Soviet Jews and today's gays in the Russian imagination, there is one rather obvious difference. The current anti-gay law invokes morality and protection of children. Right? The language of the law borrows from the discourses of child protection and innocence that circulate in the West and the United States especially. The figure of the child is clearly symptomatic in liberal democracies, a principal carrier of the future, but also a nostalgic retroactive construction, always in the temporality of not yet, forever approaching but never arriving at maturity and therefore citizenship, without sexual knowledge and hence in constant danger, indeed signifying danger. Is this not standard American discourse that justifies all sorts of government intrusions and personal sacrifice, the stuff of Amber Alerts, Whitney Houston songs, and rhetoric from the religious right? Why are Putin and his supporters borrowing this to shore up the Russian national idea? So in conclusion, if Jews were the Soviet Union's great queer subjects, symptomatic figures against whom Russianness was defined, are gays and lesbians now being employed in Russia for the same purpose, to unify and delineate the nation? And or is the hatred campaign against LGBT too reliant on American moral discourses and therefore likely to collapse under the pressure of its own contradictions? Thanks.
You know, as I listened to these wonderful presentations, I couldn't help but see how much they have in common for all the obvious and less obvious reasons. It almost seems to me that the topic for today's panel could be, you know, Russia tries to say no homo. That there's what we see again and again is this rejection of queer culture at the same time that all of these examples that are given to Westerners of Russian and Soviet culture sound so queer. The opera, the Vegas style popular entertainment that you see right and left. It's a really fascinating contradiction. So I really appreciate all the insights that we've heard today. And I'd like to open up the discussion to people in the audience who might have questions or comments to make. Yes?
So the question I'm asking myself is, what work does this new legislation do? And does it achieve any efficiency really, and where exactly? And as I was lecturing in Russia this summer, I had three small situations that I think tell us, go a great deal really telling us about what this thing is doing right now there. So the first one, and it only takes 10 seconds per situation, sorry for that. So the first one is that I met a priest who I know, who is semi-open in a way. That means he's open within the church, and who, when telling me a story after a story of how the church deals with gay priests inside the church, by moving them, from one end of the country to the other end of the country, and so on. And this is something that the church is extremely used to doing. They have procedures for that. They know how to deal with that. There's no problem. The church is not really influenced by this new wave of whatever propaganda is happening. Now, the second situation, I met with this person who some of you may know. His name is Pavel Chernomorski, who was a journalist in St. Petersburg in the late 90s and an activist in the early 2000s, and then he was in prison for about 4 years. And he is gay, and he told me a bunch of stories. He was somewhere in far north, in Arkhangelsk region, and he told me a lot of stories about how in those work camps there, so this was what is called a black zone, right, managed by voters. So how homosexuality is actually being tolerated to a certain extent. It's not a problem, and so on and so forth. And that propaganda is certainly not influencing some of the extremely important strata of the Russian society, the church and the prison system. These are things that are not at all being penetrated by this new wave. And now the third thing, I met after a couple of lectures I gave, I met this young man who was probably a first-year student from God knows where in the country, something like Belgorod region, who came up to me, and after a long exchange on the topic of the lecture, which has nothing to do with this, he asked me, are you married? And then I felt I'm not even in position to tell him that I'm gay. I'm not even in position because it's illegal in Russia. I'm not sure whether he's 18. He's a first-year student in Russia, but he's before 18 sometimes. So maybe he's 17. And then I understood, here's one thing that all this new wave really reaches. It's not only the political goal of framing the society behind this internal enemy, or against this internal enemy. That certainly exists very much. But there's also this huge social problem that it creates, that these young people out there will not have access. They will keep, as you said, not knowing that they know somebody. And that is, aside from all the political discussions we may have about it, but that is a real problem that we need to think about. How that will influence suicide rates in the provinces, the knowledge that goes out there, what will they know, and so on and so forth. So that, I think, is one of the key questions we need to think about here. Sorry for the length of this.
That was fascinating. I did want to say about the last thing, though, that your question about the example of not telling someone person to person about being gay and the threat there suggests that people in Russia obey laws, are in the habit of obeying laws, which is not really.
At least, with respect to myself, I have double citizenship. But anyway, I was there and I was asking myself, will I tell him that I'm gay? And then I thought, well, maybe he's not 18 yet, so it is illegal, so I will not.
But you know that your double citizenship is not going to save you in case.
Sure, it's not a question of
charged
citizenship.
No. The reason why I'm saying is because if you read the statute, which is extremely short, half of it is devoted to what will happen to a foreigner in case a foreigner is accused of this propaganda, which I find rather.
We'll see during the Olympic Games, shall we?
But to go to all these great lengths at adopting the law, half of which is for foreigners who, again, are supposed to come and colonize Russia. But then to your point about clergymen and prison, well, you're referring to enclosed, almost exclusively male societies. And I mean, it's not only in Russia. And if we go back to, let's say, the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, it will say that, well, obviously the existence determines consciousness, and the homosexuality springs from, originates in those enclosed male societies like prison, like military, and like church. So, and also I know in the 19th century this was an issue in terms of reassigning priests and dealing with homosexuality among clergymen. And it's fascinating the way this kind of the system preserved itself and is now being reintegrated.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying, yeah, of course, you're absolutely right. What I'm saying is that the new wave of propaganda is not really changing, at least as far as I could judge, up to having talked to these people, not really changing much within the church or inside prisons with respect to how they deal with homosexuality inside that system. So this law is not, I mean, the law and all this buzz is not really doing anything inside there. And so that's fine in those places where there's a real change. And I thought that here is a real change. This 17 or 18-year-old young man from far away in the country, that's really something different. He could have been told several years ago what this is about, and now there's no way.
It also goes to Elliot's comment about the massive divide between public and private identities in Russia. And especially with the church, I mean, everybody has known that this is a phenomenon. There are jokes about monks and all this other stuff. But the church is the most virulent and has the most probably coherent anti-gay discourse in contemporary Russia. And it doesn't miss an opportunity to speak out. In fact, all the religious groups in Russia, basically, the traditional ones, have been doing that.
The church is also currently speaking out against this juvenile justice, which is being pushed by Putin, actually, and children's rights. Like, please don't give children rights, because then it undermines traditional family rights, and we can't beat our children anymore, whatever. So I think it's interesting how it might, I think it's interesting how it connects to this, again, children protecting children and moral discourse, and how that not everybody buys into that piece of it, or that strain in it.
And in fact, to follow up on what you're saying in your presentation about children, we can point to a lot of legislation and that have been adopted and discussed in the past year or so that could be seen as repressive. A lot of it is focused around the child. We obviously have the anti-gay propaganda law. We have the anti-adoption laws. We have the censorship of television and the internet, all in the interest of the children. So this seems
cartoons
to be,
have been banned,
yeah,
like popular cartoons from the Soviet period, because the wolf in the cartoon smokes or whatever.
yeah. One accusation is that basically it's trying to treat the entire country like children who have to be protected, and therefore you're left with so little. Maria, I think you
Oh, yes, I wanted to follow up on this identity point, because there's something there that really fascinates me. This movement from associating homosexuality with a verb to a noun, and how that triggers, first of all, why? Because basically, I'm coming around to it's clearly not the action, but the identity, and then political identity, and really clearly it's about politics. That's where the problem is. I keep thinking of parallels in the Muslim world, for example, in the Gulf states. This idea of, well, there's always been a practice, as a friend of mine from Bahrain put it, everyone knows that men like to have sex with other men sometimes. It's just that being gay is not normal, right? There's something really, I think, interesting there, and I think also in the press back against identity politics as a Western import, that is somehow really crucial. Again, everyone in Petersburg artistic circles, homosexual practice has been around since we know, but the gay pride parade, that is somehow politically dangerous.
And it goes back that the homosexuality continues to be imagined in very traditional gender terms, and so it's really about active and passive, and of course it's the passive person in the sexual act, what they call the passive role, is the homosexual, and the other person is not. They're not stigmatized as having an identity, and then it comes from it's reinforced in the prison structure and things like this. So, but yeah, it's very still a very gender stratified conception of homosexuality.
Of course, you have to have that.
I appreciate the sensitivity with which the panel was working with these very challenging issues. It seems, though, that a major challenge of the discussion of LGBT in Russia that the panel may not have been addressing was describing the ways of being queer in the country. We've been discussing all kinds of reactions to queer, especially in the media, but it doesn't seem like there has been anything said about what it's like to be gay, lesbian, or transgender. If other such identities, what are the practices? It's interesting that they are in the church and prisons, but what are they on Nevsky Prospect, for instance? It's strange to see Masha Gerson in that context as a reference point on the queer experience of a Russian person. She certainly cannot be taken as an authority on that. If anything, she is a persona non grata in that environment. I wonder if any of that kind of ethnographic work, anthropological work is being done, asking people who are actually being queer about what their experience is. On a personal note, I find it offensive the comparison between gay people and Jews, to both groups. I think we want to ask queer people in Russia what their experience is. And of course, it's extremely rich and extremely expressive. Anybody who's doing any work on that.
The irony is everything like that described would be difficult to describe under the new law.
But not me.
I just want to make clear that I wasn't necessarily drawing that comparison, but I think that it's being drawn more here in the States as a way of, I think, getting activists here to sympathize with LGBT people in Russia, right? So this is something that's happening in the US.
It's also part of the discourse in Russia in that sense. It's meaningful to address that as a feature of discourse, but nonetheless, there's a lacuna in this discussion, I think. So I wonder if it works.
This is the problem that's dogged this question for so long, is that there's a lack of research, and that the culture makes it very difficult for people in an academic position to take this as their object of research. So, I mean, with the exception of Igor Kohn and a couple other people, I mean, I don't know people who feel empowered to do that. So there is some ethnographic work and fascinating stuff, I agree. I mean, this is something that has to be done, and asking people, and especially, you know, the problem with some of the ethnographic that was done, work that was done before, was, you know, they basically talked to people in Moscow and Petersburg, educated elites, but we never got, you know, how does someone in Ufa, you know, who's gay and in a place where there is no gay presence, how do they survive? I mean, the only thing I want to some ignored work maybe is Sonia Frenetta's, and David's work, but Sonia Frenetta did interviews with Siberian gays and lesbians, and it reveals fascinating stuff about how they survive in that context. And something I make a lot of use of is this one story she asked Anna, how did you find other people like you? And she said, well, I went over to someone's house for a party, and I noticed on the bookshelf there was a volume of Sappho. And I pulled it off the shelf and I started reading. And then it turns out that the host was gay, and then she and her girlfriend would go over there, and through this way, they met other people. But what's interesting to me is that I'm quite sure that the introduction to that Russian edition of Sappho insisted that she was heterosexual, because that's the Soviet, you know, line. So, you know, they read between the lines, they make use of these texts in other ways. But yeah, there are a lot of these invisible communities that form, I know, but we haven't been able to study them.
Sappho just hadn't met the right man.
That's right.
I had a student, an undergraduate, who wanted to do some ethnographic research in gay clubs in Moscow, and he went there and he got beaten up, and he's not going back. I mean, it was like the worst thing to happen.
So just on this question, I actually have a quite different impression. I have an impression that during last year, maybe the last couple of years, we saw a surge in public sociological studies of this. You know, do you remember that article that, you know, everybody, I think, has read about 2 gay tractorists somewhere in Belarus or whatever. There was a series of publications on culture.ru, on Nova Gazette, and major, these things were not there before this whole story has begun. So, yeah, you're of course right, there isn't enough serious sociology down there, but there is quite a surge in the discussion of ways of being gay tractorists somewhere in the village. And I see in St. Petersburg all these people living their Vaginov style Bambuchada lives, and they're all there. So it's going on, and we do see a number of publications suddenly out of nowhere on these issues.
When Ksenia Sobchak was interviewing Mimonov, the author of so much of this anti-gay propaganda law last week on Dush, she kept saying to him, there are many who say that you have done more for making LGBT people a topic of discussion than anyone else, that you're really helping the cause. He just responded with something but us, and so on and so forth. But that argument's being made on the channel that no one watches.
I guess the real life, the way I have had contact with it is I served in the last couple of years as an expert witness on asylum cases. And the violence against gays and lesbians is horrible at every level. Someone who is openly, especially an effeminate man, they tell stories about being beaten on the street, in their home. Often the father, one lesbian, said that her father beat her regularly when he found out. And also, we're in a strange place where there are some people who feel confident about coming out, and so the singer, was it Surganova, she came out as a lesbian, and then her fans were targeted. So they'd come out, this one lesbian wrote about how she came out of the concert with her friends, and skinheads beat them up because they figured you're a lesbian if you went to this thing. So it's a really hard time to be out when you're in a culture with absolutely no legal protections, and the police are at best indifferent.
But then also if we look at the number of gay clubs, restaurants, cafes in Moscow and St. Petersburg, there is definitely a very vibrant subculture, certainly. And I have undergraduates who are in Russia, in Moscow now, who, from the pictures they're posting on Facebook, they're having quite a gay time. But, and you would also notice that none of us are social scientists, so it would be just, we can say that certain people are doing certain work, but to talk about ethnography or sociological research with any kind of credibility, we just would not be able to do. And so I think we were focusing more on culture, and hence, and to actually, if you were interested in the question, like the gentleman earlier was saying, as soon as the law was adopted, Большой-Город, Afisha, Koltaru, and a number of other online publications in particular highlighted and profiled your regular простые люди, right? So someone works as a clerk in Moscow, for Moscow mayor in the city administration, someone is a country school teacher, et cetera, et cetera. And so that, in a way, presents outs those people publicly, but also says, look, you don't know any gay people, here are some gay people. And you don't know them because because they don't have 4 eyes and 6 ears, because they look just like you do. And also, I thought, Elliot would be more an expert to say, but just the notions of masculinity and the more effeminate kind of behavior, which in American culture would be completely taboo. In Russia, if you hug your buddy, it doesn't look suspicious. So it's just those cultural subtleties that.
I still want to emphasize the possibility of living rewarding gay lives in Russia, which I personally know a lot, not being gay myself. And I think that the kind of representation that one gets often in the U.S. media, and perhaps in part from this panel, is the horrible plight of the queer experience in Russia, which in large measure is true. I think the panel was very sensitive to the nature of the problems, but there's this whole aside to that experience that I think would do justice to queer people in Russia to recognize the rewarding aspects of that.
I think this actually plays into the other criticism that we're not really talking so much about queer experience. We're talking about what's happening in discourse and religion law. We're not talking about what real people are doing. But your point actually reinforces the idea that the comparison between Jews and gay people is either inaccurate or very accurate, because what you're talking about the idea of people assuming you can't have a good gay life there really reminds me of in the 70s and 80s how Americans assumed that if you're Jewish in the Soviet Union, you're about to be shot. That they completely misunderstood what discrimination in that context meant. Largely as a result of ignorance and a result of mobilization. It's easier to mobilize when you frame things as crisis, and especially in the Jewish community where the Holocaust, of course, is always the big reference point. So it's inaccurate, but it might be inaccurate over there, but it's, I think, kind of accurate for the way people are seeing and misseeing things over here.
I think a lot of those images of violence against gays in Russia, I was over there this summer conducting research interviewing activists for an article I'm writing. And I think a lot of it is due to the activists, the images that they portray to the Western media. I think that they very much want to emphasize these violent acts. I was at the Petersburg Pride Parade, and it was almost as if it was like set up so that violent things would happen. And a lot of activists I spoke to said that Nikolai Alexei, one activist in particular, kind of stirs things up so that people are hurt at these demonstrations. And it almost seems as if it's to portray to the West this image of violence.
Well, yeah, with Nikolai Alexeyev, I think by this point lost any kind of credibility with anybody, really. And his recent publications really betray him as someone who lost it legitimately.
Yeah.
Going back to that analogy between Hitler and Putin, isn't it being an outsider gives you a better picture? I mean, people in Germany didn't quite know what was going on. Didn't think of themselves, as that kind of a repressive society. So wouldn't that be true also in Russia at the moment with gay people, or this Jewish metaphor?
Well, I see the necessity of having a discourse with the discussion with the Russian scholar. We see different things. I think that's inevitable from our positions. Not better things or worse things, but different things. And so together sharing those things, you get an interesting.
There's a problem with jumping immediately from things are okay to Nazis.
Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be some gradations of terrible that are not as terrible. Now, of course, you could then look back 20 years from now and say, oh, see, this was the sign. But I mean, what's happening right now, as bad as it is, and as objectionable as it is, it's simply not this registration, restriction, ghettoization, literal ghettoization, checking of bloodlines and all of that. It's not that.
Much was made of this bill that was introduced that didn't become law, but that threatened to take away children of people of non-traditional.
From families with non-traditional families, something like that.
Yeah.
I think in that respect, there's something I never see mentioned in everything I read about this Russian law is clause 28 or clause 23, I don't remember, in the UK in, I think, beginning of the 1980s, which I don't remember the exact details of the law, but it was exactly, as I remember it, the same thing. It was against propaganda, they call it that way, propaganda. So the consequence was that you could not have anything saying anything good about homosexuality in a public library or in a school, and that was also in the name of protecting children. And And I think it's interesting to remember, in order to de-Russify in a way that anti-gay law in Russia, which I'm struck as you were saying that these words like LGBT, queer, and so forth are difficult to understand in Russian because there's 40 years of history behind those words. In the same way, maybe there's the lag in time, and that law is actually a law which comes 30 years. It comes in due time in a way. I don't like it, but it comes at its time in Russia. But it's actually something that we knew 30 years ago.
Basically, it underscores Russia's backwards. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm very sorry in the case of Russia that I had the feeling that it missed its transition. Spain did it. Spain in 1975, Franco died, and the dictatorship gave way to La Movida, and now Spain is a fantastic country where LGBT rights are very much on the move upwards. In Russia, we had the 1990s, and then it opened up, and there was all that discourse, and it was interesting. There was the women's movement, and the Greens, and the LGBT, the gay thing. It wasn't LGBT back then, and it was fantastic. And then starting from, I guess, 1995, people went back home, and it all quieted down. And since I see it as since 2005 is when we had also this new discourse on religion and identity. And Literatura Gazeta, which was a great thing to read back in the 1980s, and maybe one of the only things to read, is nowadays impossible to read. So it's not even backward, it's going backwards. And yes, I'm very sorry about that.
Well, the British comparison is one that the defenders of the law make a lot, especially on RT, with the Russia Today network that's aimed at us. And the problem with that comparison is, well, one, it's comparing one horrible law to another, but the situation in Britain was so completely different. When that law was being discussed and adopted, you had a thriving gay and not gay but pro-gay artistic intellectual community that rose up and spoke out about it and published about it and talked about it, so that in fact it showed how impossible it was to implement that law in a country that had an open gay life, unlike the kind that we see in at least the small towns in Russia. So I think what the difference is that the law in Britain was absolutely impossible, and there's a possibility that the law in Russia might work.
There's a great deal of support, in other words. But I also just very quickly wanted to mention we were talking about the resistance to the borrowed Western idiom of the civil rights, but among the general public, by which we understand heterosexual general public. But that is not to say that the queer community wholeheartedly accepts all the models of behavior either. And by now it's pretty dated, but do you remember the author of the Travels Behind the Iron Closet?
David Teller.
Yeah. Who I think it details pretty in a very good way Russians, gays and lesbians who don't want to come out, and they're just saying, stop bothering us, we're just not ready. And you are, with these terms and identities, that you're forcing us to do something that we not only are not ready to do, but we don't want to do.
And that also suggests that the problem with the Western models too is I think people in sort of more left-leaning progressive parts of America and Europe are used to the idea of an almost kind of natural reflexive coalition building. That is, if you are a part of a minority group that is seen to be persecuted, you sympathize with all persecuted minority groups. So we have the experience of that laundry list at a leftist protest. You have to remember every possible group that has been discriminated against everywhere. And I don't see that kind of reflexive coalition building.
Definitely what's so striking about Russia is that the women's movement there never had found common cause with the LGBT movement, like what happened in the States, and I think in the States, I mean, that kind of happened, during the 60s, and then the celebration of non-reproductive sexuality and how liberating that was. And that's never happened. In fact, the women's movement in Russia has never focused on sexual pleasure. I mean, this hasn't been one of their goals. And in fact, there were often not material conditions in place for that. I mean, people didn't have contraception. It was widely available. I mean, in the Soviet era, abortion was the #1 form of birth control. Women would have 11, and this was normal. So they didn't have the material condition to talk about sexual pleasure and didn't have a tradition of that. But, so I think there are a lot of reasons, and I don't think things should evolve the way they have in the States. I don't mean that, but I just think the discursive possibilities there are very different. And that the gay movement was able to inscribe itself into a civil rights discourse here that worked for them. I know a lot of African Americans in various points don't compare us to them because we don't support this lifestyle. But there was a discourse that was very, very powerful. And it allowed actually America in the last few years to move ahead, if you think about it in that trajectory. France and places like this, because they didn't have the same civil rights model that we inherited. So I'm just I'm looking at the discursive environment, I guess, and the possibilities. But yeah, the relationship between that discourse and everyday life is a very not obvious one and not a direct one. So.
I want to harp on my topic one last time. It seems like the most important queer event, public event in Russian life over the last couple of years is Pussy Riot. Of the 3 people arrested, the 2 people who are in jail are both straight. The person who was let go is a lesbian. It seems that as an event, what Pussy Riot was, tells me that there is sexual pleasure for women, there is expression, there is power, and in this case, gay people are not targeted for prostitution. So it seems like the most important aesthetic event in Russian last couple of years throws all of our frameworks into question.
But even Katya Samusevich, she reads gay to everybody who has a gaydar, I think. But she is not technically out. You do not see discussions of Katya Samusevich as a lesbian. Though you don't, with one rare exception, you don't see people talking about her getting married to a man either. But it's I think very telling that this really obvious thing is never discussed. And then we can't discuss it really either, because are we in the position of outing her if she's not outing herself?
I mean, even, Brodsky talks about his Fred Schmakoff in his dialogues with Salman Volkov, and he says, I knew Schmakoff was gay, but he never talked about it. And this, basically, he was saying this was the agreement we had. Don't tell me, I'm okay. And that's kind of how it is in Russia now. I don't think this law is going to be vigorously enforced. I don't think it's anything like, laws against the Jews in Nazi Germany. The only thing that reminded me of the discourse was the paranoia of these, so many gays in Russia, that the numbers were increasing, that they had elite positions in the government. I don't think this is true either. But there are other questions.
So what is the attitude in Russia towards people like Brodsky and Diaghilev or Nijinsky? How do they explain them, or do they just because they were ex-Hate state, they were decadent and not considered? Does Russia embrace them at all and take credit for their talent?
Yes, but not as gay. People
Not
like
as gay.
Nijinsky,
Diaghilev, Nijinsky, it's just not discussed.
It's not discussed. They finally, in Ufa, because I was in Ufa a couple of years ago, they finally have a museum there. They were able to embrace him as a native son, but the museum says nothing about the fact that he was homosexual.
Well, same in Kazan with the Nureyev Festival, which takes place every spring.
And Nureyev, who's more contemporary, the same thing.
Yeah, the great artist, wonderful contribution to our great culture, but it's not proper to discuss.
Are the books written about Nureyev available to read in Russia, secretly or privately?
No, they're
They're not bound or
No, not
anything,
bound.
but people just don't acknowledge it. It's like this blank, I mean, I've done research on some of these figures, and I go to the archives, and if I were to ever bring up the fact that they would just look at people just give me this kind of quizzical, look.
Liberace used to sue people who said that he was gay.
Right.
And it worked. No, I'm serious. There were women, there were his fans saying, why do they keep saying he's gay? Because it is possible not to see what's right before your eyes. Any other questions or comments out there?
I don't think they have a way to understand why that would be important. And I'm not saying it is that you understand it important. An artist through his sexuality, that's what we do in the West. I'm not saying everyone should do that, but they don't theoretically understand why that would be necessary. And so, yes, they know Wilde was gay, they know Tchaikovsky was gay, but why would we talk about that? And so, especially in the academy, I mean, when you think our cultural studies comes out of psychoanalysis and revisionist Marxism, and those are two movements that were, not valid or relevant there. So they don't really have a way to connect us. I was interested to see a full collected works of Andrei Gide in Russian, and in the introduction, boy, this was in 2000 something, and the author was going to great length to explain why he would mention the fact that Gide was a homosexual. But he really had to make this argument, and it was a new argument to make in the Russian context.
And in fact, I think this goes back to the problem of identity, that one of the reasons people don't see this as an issue is that talking about Oscar Wilde as being gay is talking about what he's doing in the bedroom. And we don't talk about what anyone is doing in the bedroom. We do talk about who they're married to and their various lovers and so on and so forth, but we don't talk about what they did. And I think talking about homosexuality is talking about what they did, and why should we be talking about that? It's only one aspect.
Yeah, I think we may want also not to generalize too much when we say they or people, right? I mean, certainly there are people, curators of those museums probably have no idea even why this was important. But we also have, Colonna publications, Media Journal, Meteorology, and so on and so forth, and people who clearly understand the importance, write about that, talk on the radio about that, and so on. So these people also exist.
Yes, no, there's some Volchek is a great example, some very, very important publishers who have been getting this. But even going over some of their things, there's a reluctance. I was reading something on Sophia Parmok in the introduction, never used the word lesbian. And this is fine, I'm not saying you should, but I'm just saying it's a different thing, the expectation is not there. There's a resistance to this idea of a gay, lesbian identity as an identity. And one of the specialists in Wilde said, the Western people divide Wilde into his Catholicism and his homosexuality, and this is all lies. And so it's this idea of a kind of that's, unfair to the person to see them like that. But that's what they used to say about women's literature too, when they tried to say, there's a zhenskaya literatura. They said, no, we have good literature, bad literature, not women's literature. That changed.
Why should we talk about people's flaws?
Hey, I just had a question. You all did a wonderful job of doing this sort of back history of the discursive possibilities, and especially love the analysis of the space within the language and the lack of sort of neutral terminology. But I'm curious, just within the last year and a half, 2 years, let's say, how do you feel that the discursive possibilities have changed for either self-identification or for discussion of the gay or LGBT communities? Because I'm wondering, there's always this question of, is it tied to anti-Putin opposition politics right now, that there's more pro-gay support among certain populations, et cetera, or is it a civil rights issue, or is it something completely separate from both of them? I mean, do you think anything has really changed in the last couple of years, besides the issuing of the law in the Sochi Olympics, possible boycott and so forth? Is it really just a longer story, or something different in the last couple of years?
Kind of waiting to see how certain people react, like Dmitry Kuzmin, if he sees this as an opportunity for him to come out, or if that's still not viable. People like Kirill Medvedev who are saying, we need a political art now under Putin, right? If a gay agenda would be part of that political art or not, I think it remains to be seen.
Yeah. Just on the level of language and input, just like I was saying, that little boy is dated because it's simply because gay is rapidly replacing it. instance, and yeah, now and with queer in Petersburg there is the International Festival of Queer Cultura, queer culture. That's
But like Gulliboy, for instance, it's interesting. It feels dated to me. I mean, I wouldn't have said that with confidence, but I picked up on that a bit. But I'm wondering, if you think that's dated from the last 2 years or like the last 6 years? I'm honestly just curious, like how rapidly things are changing right now, or like not they're all cut,
Yeah.
which I think is really interesting. Is the emergence of okay, do you need to have a word for sort of heterosexual? When do you know when that would have emerged? I mean, I'm just like.
So I don't live in Russia full time,
Right,
so
I know.
it would be hard for me to judge. And then, of course, what we're not in a way also discussing is the difference between capitals and the provinces in Russia. Russia is a giant country, and we are focused on Moscow and St. Petersburg. While it's probably not fair to make blanket statements about the entire culture just based on those two. But yes, with what I really. I wouldn't even know. Yes, but with naturalka, the word itself derives, as far as I'm aware, as far as I know, from the gay subculture in the argot, and that's late 80s, early 90s, and then but now it just all of a sudden emerged in heterosexual discourse. So, and that I would say is indeed within the past couple of years. And just for me personally, maybe this is too personal, but the impetus we're talking about language was when I was coming out to my parents, I didn't know what to say, which words to use really, because there was not a neutral enough word, and there was not a word that they would understand. They might not even understand what gay is. They might have a very murky feeling about it, but still.
And when did LGBT start to use? Because it seems like I woke up one day and they were saying LGBT, and that seems very new. Do you have any sense of when it started?
Well, venues like this queer, the Kvia, the journal, I mean, it's been at the forefront in introducing a lot of these terms that they speak.
But they've spread. You know, now people are expected to know what LGBT means, which is amazing. I think a few years ago, they wouldn't have meant anything.
Building on the language question, I am curious about the highly gendered use of marriage and marriage to a woman and man. So in Russian press, when they're talking about same-sex marriages abroad, how do they describe that then?
I would say it's in male linguistic idiom.
Okay.
Yeah.
So even lesbian.
So it just would say that but homosexual also is gendered as male, masculine rather. So that's why if you say that homosexuals are getting married, it would be gendered as masculine.
Yeah. Also, the tradition would be marriage. I mean, it's just the default male subject.
Yeah, but it's the default male subject.
Yeah, but wait a second. There's the typical word for it is gay brak, which is neutral, right? So
that's what Artemy did in the quote that in his entry. What he was saying that there is also an extremely neutral way of saying зарегистрировать брак to marriage to register marriage in City Hall Town Hall. So that would be neutral.
But it's not. But that's not a conversational way.
No, gay brak is a conversation.
But for a verb.
No, the verb, no, absolutely.
Gay brak, that's like.
No.
May I just go back? I have 2 points. One, I wanted to go back to what Michael was saying about to what extent are those exiled personalities are embraced in Russia now, and they certainly are, and it's not a problem. You can go to a bookstore and buy a book about Oscar Wilde, and these, alongside these books, and this is, I guess, we'll go back to what Krista was saying. There are books of affirming queer existence, but there is an example of a great Silver Age poet, Russian poet and writer Mikhail Kuzmin, who was fortunate enough to die in 1935, I believe, before the purges started. Stalinist purges were started. So, because he was not sent to camps, and his name was really not tarnished by any of the politics, he would have been a natural candidate for study in Russia and the Soviet Union. But it was evident that he was gay. That's why his name during the Soviet years was kind of under radar. And his there's this great quest for Kuzmin's diaries that are in the vaults of the Russian archive, state archive for the literature and the arts. Yes, and only recently did the archive actually start releasing them, because before they'd say, well, it's improper, and it's improper because he was a homosexual. So it's not the Soviet Union anymore, and there was all kinds of information available, and I don't think there was any kind of strict censorship. So that would be one example. And also, yes, we are talking about the LGBT rights in this particular law, but that law is only one in a string of horrific laws that don't necessarily have to deal with the repression of gays and lesbians in Russia, but children's rights. And right now the law is being considered for that would essentially wipe out the retirement for most Russians, and what they in Russia now call the specifically printer, the printer that lost its mind, and that just keeps spewing out the new laws.
So to add on, I mean, about Oscar Wilde, I mean, there are tons of reeditions of his works in post-Soviet Russia, and if you saw them, you'd think, oh yes, they're so open to Wilde, and isn't this interesting? I did a study of the introductions to these and the paratextual material, and it's always about Wilde. He's a Dostoevskian character in the Russian imagination. Still, this is the Silver Age take on Wilde that continues very strong in the critical literature on Wilde today. He's, as one critic said, he is the troubled artist who finds his way to God. And so the two key texts in his oeuvre in Russia are De Profundis and On Reading Jail, and they continue to be. And they say this is the essential Wilde, De Profundis. And he's a Dostoevsky, and this is without the censorship, but even the ones support, more gay-friendly publishers. This is the narrative, and this has long been the way that gays found a way into Russian traditional identity discourses, is through this. They were effete geniuses who suffered for their sins, and this great suffering actually was their art. And so to go back to your Tchaikovsky, it's interesting that there was an Eichmann ballet, The Mystery of Life and Death, about Tchaikovsky, which intimated, right, it was ballet choreographed, but it seemed clear that they were being overt about his homosexuality. But of course his homosexuality was presented as this horrible thing for him, which led to his death. And this was it. The gay people had to die.
Which is familiar from Art of the West.
Yeah.
I remember talking to someone in the 90s who heard about there was the organization Tchaikovsky or something like that, for the gay rights organization. He said, I don't really care what people do, but why do they have to drag Tchaikovsky in?
You're aware of a film by Ken Russell, which is probably the most pro-homosexual interpretation of Tchaikovsky. It's called The Music Lovers. And it's really over the top, outrageously, it's got Glenda Jackson in there, in quite a masturbation scene. But it's hard to find. They haven't put it out on DVD. I think maybe Glenda did 2 movies where she masturbates. One of them is that, the other one is The Devils. And neither of them are available. I have a feeling maybe she's got something to do with that.
There was also a blockbuster biopic in Russia on Yesenin, and of course, again, nothing about his homosexuality.
This is another point.
Well, we have to yield the room to whoever's using it next. So I want to thank you all for coming and thank our panelists. This has been a